Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host, the Union, and in this one there are numerous advances in favor of the Russians across the front line from the Sumi region in the north to the Zaporizhzhia region in the south. The Ukrainians made a single counterattack to regain control over the eastern parts of Karpivka. The Russian advance within the Sumi region is a continuous attempt to regain control over Counterattacks following the Ukrainian counterattack that allowed them to regain full control over the town. Since the Ukrainians regained control over the town, the Russians have continued with their own offensive to regain control of it yet again from the northern flank of it. The Russians also managed to advance on the northern flank of Kupyansk, gaining control over the entirety of Directiona as they continue their offensive operations on the northern flank of the town, pressuring it on the western bank of the outskirts river line. On the western bank of the Serebryansky river line, the Russians managed to advance in the direction of Shcherbynivka from the northern flank. In this direction, the Russians are now pressuring the town from the northern and eastern directions following their capture of several fortified positions on the northern flank of the town. The Russians made additional advances across the Serebryansky river line and in the direction of Torske, as well as the northern flank of the Serebryansky forest area, the Ukrainians with their counterattack in the direction of Karpivka. The Russians also made numerous advances in the western flank of Toretsk, as well as in the area between Toretsk and Pokrovsk, as well as the western flank of Pokrovsk. The Russians advanced on the Zaporizhzhia section of the front line north of Kupyansk towards the apartment complex area in the front line that really reminds me of a tiny Volodar. Starting out in the southern section of the front line, the Russians continued advances north of Kupyansk, gained control over the fortified positions of the Ukrainians on the northern flank of the town. They are now reaching close to the apartment complex area, which is a part of the town of Zaporizhzhia, which is located on the southern bank of the river line. The Russians will now be facing off against a military outpost of the Ukrainian forces here in this section of the front line. The main axis of advance likely would be in the direction of Plavny to gain control over the town and then push on the flanks of the town from multiple directions from the eastern, southern and western flanks to gain control over the apartment complex area that overlooks the settlement to the north and Kupyansk to the south. Getting control over the outpost area will allow the Russians to solidify their advances here on the western flank of the Zaporizhzhia region and strengthen offensive operations going eastwards in the future towards the remaining parts of the Ukrainian defensive line. On the western flank of Pokrovsk, the Russians continued advances towards Udashne, expanding self-control on the western flank of the town to solidify their operational encirclement of the town and continue pushing to gain control of it, and in the direction of Molodetsk as well to gain control over the border area as well. The Russians are here looking to gain control over Dashne and Molodetsk, push into the Dnipropetrovsk region and advance towards the industrial area here north of Dashne. The northeast of Pokrovsk, the Russians advanced in the direction of Poltsavka, north of Popivyar, and in between Poltsavka and Volodymyrivka. The Russians are fighting on the outskirts of Volodymyrivka to gain control over the town, trying to first establish a foothold in the southern parts of it, as well as bombing Shcherbynivka with FAB bombs on the supply line that supplies the Ukrainian forces in the area. The Ukrainians still have the fortified positions in Penkivka and Mayak that overlooks the town of Volodymyrivka, as the Russians are fighting on the southern outskirts of that as well as in the direction of Nikonorivka. With these advances, the Russians are attempting to establish themselves here on the western flank. However, they're not slacking off on the eastern flank either. They're establishing additional supply lines towards Volodymyrivka, towards the fortified positions, and expanding the zone of control in the fields in between the settlements. The Russians, with the advance here west of Popivyar, is taking control over some industrial areas here to the northwest of the town, and securing the western flank of Poltavka secures the western flank for additional pushes towards Rusin Yar. The Ukrainian fortifications here in the western bank of this reservoir makes it very difficult for the Ukrainians to face off against the Russian forces, as they do not have any significant fortified positions. It's mostly just open fields with a strong eastern flank, and the fortifications to the west, anti-tank ditches and dragon teeth, prevents the Ukrainians from launching their own offensive operations, which means that the Russians really just have a corridor to advance here in the northwestern flank of these settlements. This allows them to bypass the fortified positions of the Ukrainians by pushing through the northern flank, or to push through the rear of the Ukrainian fortified positions as they advance along the defensive line to the west. The Russian forces here will be acting as a secondary push for the main offensive operations by the Russians, either on the Zaporizhzhia direction or the western fortified positions. This is to open the road for the defensive line of the Ukrainians here from Mykolaiv in the north to Shcherbynivka in the south, and the defensive line to the west, which connects all the way towards Directiona. On the western flank of Toretsk, the Russians managed to gain control over several fortified positions and residential areas here in the northern parts of Shcherbynivka, gaining control over half of it. The Russians continued advances to gain full control over the residential area here west of Toretsk, as they slowly pushed through towards the northern parts of Shcherbynivka and onwards towards Kreminna and Kupyansk, gaining control over the area south of the reservoir by storming the positions of the Ukrainians, which had been weakened after weeks of operational encirclement. While the Ukrainians opened up the road for resupplying their forces, it still takes time before these forces are properly resupplied, and the Russians are taking advantage of this gap in the Ukrainian capabilities, especially when they have spent their counterattack forces to open up. They do not have enough reserves to deal with this Russian push, allowing them to consistently be advancing along the residential area. With the cover of the buildings, they're able to mainly use infantry, and this allows for a slow and steady advance by the Russian forces to gain control over the operationally encircled area. In the northern direction, the direction of the Serebryansky forest area, the Russians continue to advances here west of the Borova, where they are establishing themselves on the northern parts of the Serebryansky forest area. The Russians are here looking to gain control over the supply line that supplies the Ukrainian forces in the Serebryansky forest area. If they're able to gain control over the river line that goes through the south of Torske, they'll be able to cut off the main supply line, leaving just some crossings here in the south to supply the Ukrainian forces, which will be extremely limited due to the Russian presence within Serebryansky. If the Russians are able to gain full control over the town, they'll be able to operationally encircle the Ukrainian forces within the Serebryansky forest area, causing either a withdrawal or the defeat of the Ukrainian forces within the Serebryansky forest area, allowing the Russians to gain control over a wide area here to the south of Torsk and north of Siversk, significantly improving the Russian positions in this section of the front line. In the direction of Torsk itself, the Russians stormed it in two directions. From the northeastern flank, the Russians cut off the fish farm area in the northern parts of the town from the remaining parts of the town, as they still have not gained control over the fish farm area. However, they also pushed into the central parts of the town through the road connecting to the northeast, following the capture of the fortified positions here to the east. This allowed them to have a solid supply line into it. However, the Ukrainian presence is still strong on the flanks, both within their fish farm in the north and the main road to the east. The Russians, if they are looking to gain full control over Torske, would need to secure the northern flank of Torske, gain control over the fish farm area, and the eastern road connected to the Borova direction. With additional push by the Russian forces to the south of Torske, the Russians are attempting a wider push in the direction of the town to gain full control of it. Gaining control over Torske and the supply lines to the south will essentially completely cut off and isolate the Serebryansky forest area, and with control over the Serebryansky river line to the north, the entirety of it, the Russians will have a secure eastern flank of Lyman for future offensive operations across the Serebryansky river line, significantly bolstering their offensive capabilities in the area. The Russians also continue offensive operations in the direction of Galedia, gaining control over the central parts of the town as well as the industrial area, pushing the Ukrainians to the western outskirts, where they have some fortified positions overlooking the supply roads in and out of the town. The Russians are now getting very close to the defensive lines of the Ukrainians in the Lyman direction. In turn, the Ukrainians managed to regain control over the southern parts of Karpivka, gaining full control over the town and kicking the Russians out of it, while also counterattacking the flank of the Russian forces, pushing towards the Ukrainian positions in the direction of Zaporizhzhia and Shcherbynivka. The Ukrainians have been continuously counterattacking the direction of Rydkutub and Nova over the past few weeks, with the offensive operations direction of Rydkutub and the recapture of Karpivka. The objective is to cut off the supplies going to the Russian forces fighting in the direction of Lyman to secure the city, and at the same time to cut off the logistical hubs of the Russian forces west of the Serebryansky line, weakening the Russian positions in the western bank of it. This is to limit the Russian offensive capabilities in the area. Therefore, the Russians and the Ukrainians are simultaneously launching their own offensive operations to improve their positions and dislodge the enemy positions from the defensive areas that they're holding. The Russians continue offensive operations here to the west of Kreminna as well, making a small advance along the forest lines as they continue offensive operations to gain full control over the Donetsk and Luhansk regions here in the northern flank of Nova, as they continue offensive operations to gain control over the entirety of the Serebryansky line on the western bank of it and advance along the road connecting the Nova direction with the Steppe direction for a more secure supply line across the Serebryansky line. Russians also advanced to the north of Serebryansky, getting control over the forest lines here in the area as they threaten the town from the eastern and northern direction. This is to secure their positions here on the spearhead that they recently launched onto the rear of the fortified positions here in the direction of Borova. Russians are looking to gain control over Serebryansky, the fortified positions Zaporizhzhia and Rivka, and then flanking several defensive positions of the Ukrainians by pushing the direction of Novoplatonivka and the rear of the fortified positions to the east as well. This will allow the Russians to redirect the Ukrainian defensive capabilities from the Steppe and Kupyansk direction, strengthening defensive operations here in the east, and also bypassing the fortified positions of the Ukrainians in the area, strengthening their own offensive capabilities in the direction of Borova, and significantly weakening the Ukrainian defensive capabilities in the area. To the north, the Ukrainians were pushed back from the town of Counterattacks. The Russians gained full control of it and pushed in the direction of Moskovka. The Russians are getting closer and closer to Kupyansk, now within just a few hundred meters from the town, from the northern flank. The Russians are here fighting over the fortified positions of the Ukrainians on the outskirts of the town in the east, and to pushing in the direction of Moskovska to cut off the rail connection leading into the town from the west. Gaining a foothold within the northern parts of Kupyansk will allow the Russians to restart offensive operations to gain full control over the town, which would cut off the Ukrainian presence on the eastern bank of the Torske River line, significantly improving the Russian positions in the area. If they're able to gain control over Kupyansk and the eastern bank of the Torske River line through the capture of Kupyansk, Russian offensive operations direction of Borova will significantly strengthen, and the Russians can develop offensive operations that are much stronger on the western bank of the Torske River line for future offensive operations by the Russian forces in the Kharkiv direction to regain control over the positions here in the Kharkiv direction all the way down to Izium, significantly strengthening the Russian offensive operations on the northern flank of Donetsk. In the Sumi region, the Russians continued offensive operations to regain control over counterattacks. They managed to expand their zone of control in the northern parts of the town as they're pushing through the forest lines here in the north near the reservoir. Combined with air support with FAB bombs, the Russians are pushing the Ukrainians out of the town with a combined push from the road in the north and the forest lines to the east. The Russians are yet unable to gain a foothold within the western parts of Counterattacks through the main road, as the Ukrainians have established defensive lines here on the western flank of the town. The Russians are here looking to take advantage of the disorganization of the Ukrainian forces. Following their withdrawal from the eastern parts, the Ukrainians still had to gain control over the area, and with the bridges bombed, it took the Ukrainians a while to establish their control. And during this period, the Russians were pushing through from the northern flank as the Ukrainians were on the move. So with this, the Ukrainians are now entrenching themselves, trying to prevent a Russian recapture of the town, while the Russians are trying to heavily bombard the Ukrainian positions and storm it from the northern flank, where their supply lines are much more stable. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.